Pray with me, please. God, I thank you that you are so incredibly gracious to us. And Father, I come this morning and I ask that you would forgive me of my sinfulness, the struggles that I have. And I pray that you would help me to get beside and beyond myself, because my friends in this room, they need to hear from you. And I pray that you would help me to deliver your message appropriately, honestly. And I ask that you would help us to listen to your words as if they're your words and not the words of men. I thank you for this time. I thank you for these people. And Father, together we're seeking to serve you. So just help us in that venture, and that's our prayer. In the name of Jesus, amen. One of the things that I have noticed as I have become an older pastor is that there are fewer and fewer people who keep trying to tell me how to be a pastor. Now, it's not because I have it all figured out. I think it's because they figure, you know what, we'll just outlast him, and maybe not so much. But I'll tell you, man, that's over the 40 years. It's been a wonderful journey, but it's been sometimes. Sometimes people in the past have come up. They've told me how to speak. They've told me what to speak on. I even had one guy tell me what to wear, but that's entirely, and how to wear it, and that's an entirely different subject in itself. But the thing is that I find that in many ways has gone away. And one of the things that I do remember is that years ago, one of the best pieces of advice that I was ever given was, Lane, what I want you to do is I want you to stop answering questions that nobody's asking. You know, because you come out of Bible college and seminary, and you figure you want to share all of this knowledge, and so you're telling people all about all kinds of things that they're really not that interested in. I mean, really, who cares how many angels can fit on a garbanzo bean? I mean, that's not, or really, who really cares who the four horsemen of the apocalypse are? I mean, do we have to have all of that stuff nailed down and figured out? And so I know that early in my ministry, I spent a lot of years answering questions that nobody was asking, and I appreciated that piece of advice. Now, on our sign out there, it says that we at Valley Christian, we are personal and we are practical. And so where I wanted to start this morning was to give you something that was really, really practical, something that you can hang on to. And so I have an article here that I want to read part of to you, and it's in the theme of something incredibly practical. This article is entitled, How to Survive a Bear Attack. Okay? So I'm thinking that everybody needs to know these kind of things. I know that we're getting at the end of bear season here in the mountains, but I want you to listen to some. This has, with pictures, it has 11 steps to survive a bear attack. And the first one is to identify the bear quickly upon your encounter. Now, I'm not sure if you're supposed to figure out his name, but it goes on. It says that black bears kind of act one way, and brown bears or grizzly bears, they act another way. But it says the first thing that you do is you identify the bear. That's not the first thing I do, okay? It says number 2 is quickly assess whether the bear is behaving defensively or is attacking you to clear its path to food. So you ask the bear, are you trying to attack me, or is this just something that you're doing? Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3 down here is, regardless of whether you're being attacked or for predatory or defensive reasons, a bear is dangerous when he decides to attack. Okay? I'll bet you didn't know that. But you do now, and there's a whole 3 paragraphs to get there. Number 4 is to deal with a bear charge as calmly as possible. Yeah, the bear's charging and we're going to be calm. That's what you got to do. Now, number 5 is know when it's okay to play dead and when it's not. I'm thinking it's okay to play dead after you stop breathing. And then number 6 is exploit possible bear weaknesses. He's a bear. He doesn't have any weaknesses. Number 7, fight with whatever you have. Yeah, okay. We use on now 8 is pull out your pepper spray and use it. Now I always carry pepper. I don't have it with me this morning. You know, I don't have. If you're going to go on a hike someplace that you think that you need to take pepper spray with you because there's a bear there, don't go. I mean, it's real simple. Just don't go there. Number 9 is consider the involvement of those accompanying you. That's a polite way of saying you don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to outrun the slowest person in your group. Okay. Yeah. Number 10 is escape as soon as it's safe to do so. That's number 10. And number 11 is be realistic. You're probably going to get eaten anyways. As I'm going through this list, as I was looking at and several other lists that I saw as I was preparing for this, one of the things that struck me in there is every one of those steps was, in my opinion, counterintuitive. One of the things that, not so much in this article, but other articles said that by no means should you ever run when you come across a bear. By no means should you ever run. That's the first thing I'm going to do. I mean, I realize that a bear can run 30 miles an hour. And then it says don't climb a tree because bears. Every step as you go through there is counterintuitive. I mean, what it's saying is that if you want to survive this bear attack, then you're probably going to have to do something that you don't really want to do. Or maybe another way to say this is if you are going to overcome something, sometimes it requires you to do things that you don't want to do. The best thing to do is the last thing sometimes that you want to do. Now, we have seen this happen over and over and over again in the time that we have been studying the life of Joseph. And by the way, I'm going to end that particular series this morning. But Joseph overcomes by being faithful to God and by not doing, in a lot of cases, what he would probably like to do. I mean, he overcomes his hurt, the initial hurt of being rejected by his family. He overcomes that by not blaming other people, or he doesn't play the victim. I mean, that would have been the natural thing, but he rises above that. And he releases that hurt, and he moves forward. When he's faced with temptation, he overcomes temptation, not by giving in, and he doesn't overcome temptation by trying to use his wits to fight against it. He overcomes temptation by running. Now, that's not unusual. The Bible says flee a lot of things. As a matter of fact, Paul's very pointed when he talks to Corinthians. He says you need to flee sexual immorality. So that's sometimes the very best. Now, that may not be the most natural thing for us to do, but that's the message that he gives to us. He overcomes discouragement in his life by not wallowing in his self-pity. He doesn't use it as an excuse for doing nothing and for any kind of apathy. What he does is he moves forward by being thankful. Talk about counterintuitive. When you're discouraged, you need to learn to be thankful. He overcomes everything, all the trappings that come with success, by not stepping into the spotlight and accepting the accolades, but he steps back and he realizes that anything good that happens is from the hand of God. I mean, he says, I can't do it, but God can. And he overcomes bitterness. We're going to talk a little bit more about that this morning. He overcomes by bitterness, not by getting revenge. I mean, that would feel natural, and it would feel good to get some revenge. We kind of like that feel. You don't want to get even. He's not trying to do that. What he does is he extends grace. Now, that's not the natural, and that's not the normal thing to do. Now, I know that a lot of times we face obstacles in our own lives. And we know when we're in the middle of something, a lot of times, most of the time, we know what God is calling us to do. But we don't want to do it. I mean, I get it. You don't feel like forgiving them. I mean, what they did to you, that was absolutely unforgivable. It's not fair, and it's not right. I understand that, but you've got to realize that the longer that you hold on to those things in your life, the longer that you wait, the deeper the bitterness is, and anger and resentfulness, the deeper that grows and grows. And I know it's easy to resent when you're going through be resentful when you're going through difficult times. I understand that. I mean, it's not your fault. It's not your fault, and it's fair if you want to get angry and be resentful. But all that does is it holds you back and keeps you from doing what God's called you to, and it actually keeps other people away from you. So, as we look through Joseph's life, and we close that out this morning, just realize that again and again, he and God challenges us to do things that just really don't feel natural. All right, here's the story. At 17 is where we really meet Joseph. And Joseph has, by this time, his mother has passed away in childbirth with his younger brother. But at 17, we meet Joseph, and he has this dream. And he knows that the dream has come from God. And dream, essentially, is that Joseph, you're going to be something great. And the dream is that people around him, particularly his family, would bow down to him. Now, one of the things that we learned early on in this story is that if you have a dream from God about your brothers or sisters, don't tell them. Don't ever do that. Just keep it to yourself. But he has this dream, and it's that he would be the ruler, and he shares it with them. And so it's a little bit drastic, but they decide to sell him into slavery when they decide not to kill him. So they sell him into slavery. And he's a prisoner in all senses of the word. And he is bought by this guy by the name of Potiphar, who is one of the king's, the Pharaoh's highest officials. And Joseph does pretty well in there, and he rises up, and he's in charge of Potiphar's household. And it looks like maybe he's fulfilling some of the things that God had in store for him. And maybe he's thinking to himself, excuse me, well, maybe I've got to make a little adjustment here, but I can do that. Things seem to be going pretty well. But the problem is that Potiphar's wife takes a liking to him. And Potiphar's wife does everything that she can to get Joseph to go to bed with her. And like we said, the more that he resists, the more that she persists, and she keeps going and keeps going. She sets him up finally, and he gets charged of attempted rape. And he gets put in prison. Now, the prison that he goes to, it's not like going to jail in the United States. I mean, he has no appeal process. He's a prisoner. He's just a slave in the first place, and they don't care. And so he is put into the king's prison, and it seems like he's got absolutely no way out. No way out. It just seems like one obstacle after another, and then a couple of the king's officials, the cupbearer and the baker, they get imprisoned with him, and they have a couple of dreams, and Joseph interprets those dreams. One of them's not so good for the guy. One of them's really good for the cupbearer, and he says, "Remember me when you get restored." But the cupbearer doesn't remember him. And so it's just one thing after another, and time again we see Joseph going through all of these obstacles in his life. But we find that we find that there is one thing that is true in the midst of all this, and this phrase keeps coming up time and time again. The Lord was with Joseph. Now, I think that that's put in there as much to remind us as it is for everything. It doesn't look like the Lord's with Joseph. If the Lord was with Joseph, then things are going to go well for him, and they're not going so well. He's in prison. Or the cupbearer has forgotten all about him, and time after time it looks like it's stuff, but the Bible reminds us that the Lord was with Joseph. Now, we have this problem. And the problem is that we tend to equate God's presence with blessings in our life. Now, you may be thinking, no, I'm not one of those kind of Christians. I don't do that. I don't send in my $20 expecting to get fourfold back and those kind of things. But you know, on some scale, on some level, we struggle with that. We equate blessings in our life, if God is with us, then things are going to be running smoothly for us, and things are going to be. We want the dream, but we don't want the difficulties that go with it. We want the opportunities that God's running, but we don't want the obstacles that get in the way. And if we think that it's not happening the way that we think it should happen, then we tend to think that God must be absent. But the story is that no matter what was happening to Joseph on the outside, the Lord was with him. It may not seem like it, but God was with him. And it may not seem like it to you right now. You may be going through one of those things. And it may not seem like God is present, but he is. You can trust him. So Joseph goes through this horribly difficult season for 13 years. And 13 years later, it all changes. Joseph is now 30 years old, and he's brought to Pharaoh because Pharaoh has had his own set of dreams, and nobody can interpret them. And so Joseph is brought forward, and Joseph says, look, I can't do it, but God can. And he does. And as a result of that, Joseph is put in charge of practically all of Egypt. The Bible says this in Genesis chapter 41, verse 44. It says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I'm Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. In an afternoon, it looks like. In an afternoon, Joseph goes from being in prison to being in the palace. And it seems to me like maybe it's at this point that Joseph senses that this is the fulfillment of the dream, but God's not done yet. And Joseph has moved on because that's the way he has done it. But even though Joseph has moved on, I wonder if there weren't those times at night when he's thinking to himself, man, I remember what it was like in my dad's house. And my dad, he loved me so much that he gave me that beautiful coat. I wonder how he's doing. And I don't want to remember, but I remember those brothers, and I remember how bad they were to me. I remember how much it seems like they hated me. I didn't know I did anything that wrong. I mean, he had to be thinking these things at night. But he doesn't dwell on it. I think one of the reasons why he doesn't dwell on it, he doesn't have time to, because for the next 7 years, because that's what the dream said the first 7 years there's going to be plenty. And so for the first 7 years, he is spending all of his time organizing the nation so that they were storing food in storehouses, because the next 7 years were going to be a famine, and he's preparing for that. So he doesn't have time the first 7 years because he is preparing everybody to be taken care of. He doesn't have time the next 7 years because they're in the midst of this famine, and he is responsible for making sure that the people don't starve to death. That people have exactly. And then one day it happens. I mean, he's done this a lot of days. He's overseeing this distribution process. And he's handed out food to thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. But one day as the distribution's going on, he looks up and he sees 10 men. And he says, I recognize those guys. Those are 10 of my brothers. Those 10 guys, those are my brothers. And they need help. They've come because they need help. And they don't recognize Joseph, but he recognizes them. And he says, and he recognizes, he's got to say to himself, these are the guys who sold me into slavery. Chapter 42, verse 6 says, Joseph was a governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces on the ground. This is it. This is the dream. This is a dream that he had told his brothers about, and so as a result of that, because he had told them about this is what's going to happen, that's why they sold him into slavery. This is it. I mean, there are a lot of ways that he could have responded at this point. He could have had them arrested and executed, and nobody would have questioned it. Could have done it right there, and then maybe he'd have felt better because, and now he's paid them back. Or he could have simply said, you know what, I'm going to send you guys back home. Maybe I'll give you just enough to survive, but I'm going to send you back home. Or maybe he counts them again, and he says there's 10 of them. And there's supposed to be 11. And he knows that the youngest one, the only one who shares the same mother as he's not there. And maybe he's wondering, I don't know, maybe it crosses his mind, maybe they did the same thing to Benjamin that they did to me. He's got to be wondering these things. And so what he does is he puts them through a series of tests. And that's all in Genesis chapter about 42, 43, and through there. Anyway, I'm not going to go read all of that, but I encourage you to take some time to read that. Read that story. It's such a wonderful story. Read it over and over again. And so he puts them through this series of tests. He takes them prisoner, first thing he does, and he accuses them of being spies. Anyway, he eventually he tells them, the conversation comes up about a younger brother because he's gone into all of this to kind of test him. And eventually they say, yeah, we've got a younger brother. And he says, okay, I want you to bring that younger brother back here. But here's the deal. One of you has to stay. One of you has to stay while you go get him and bring him back to me so that I can see that you are not lying to me. Because if you don't go back and get this younger brother, then I'm going to know that you're lying to me, and you guys are done. Now, of course, they don't know why. They don't know why this is happening. They just know that if they want to keep their lives, they have to do what he says, and they want to live. They're confused, and they're scared. And what's beautiful about this story is that we have the account of them talking to each other at this particular point. Now, they begin talking to each other, and clearly they're doing it in Hebrew because they think this Egyptian official, he doesn't know any Hebrew. But he does, because that's who he is. And so they're talking to each other, and they say this, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded for us for his life, but we wouldn't listen. And that's why this distress has come upon us. And then it goes down and it says, finally, it says, now we must give an accounting for our blood. Okay, they're talking about Joseph. We did the wrong thing. Remember when he's in the cistern and he's in the cistern and they're having a picnic right next door? And he's pleading. But they don't pay any attention. And he says, oops, now we're kind of praying for that, or we're paying for that. So at this point, Joseph realizes that they realize what they've done. And maybe this has been, it appears that this has been hanging heavy on them for 22 years. That they've been struggling with everything that they had done. So, starting in Genesis chapter 44, and again, I want to encourage you to really go back and read all of that. In Genesis 44, they go back and they get Benjamin, and they bring Benjamin back to Egypt. And Joseph has this great big dinner for all of them. And he sets them down. The Bible says that he set them down from the oldest to the youngest. Now, I don't know what they're thinking about at this point, or maybe they're thinking, how in the world does this guy know who is the oldest and who is the youngest? And it doesn't really explain that, but that's what happened. As he has dinner for them, and then he sends them on their way. But Joseph has done one thing. He has put a silver cup that belongs to the kingdom. He's put a silver cup in Benjamin's traveling bag. And so when they leave town, Joseph sends his guys after him. And he says, look, we think you guys stole something. And they say, we didn't steal anything. And then they open the bags, and there is the cup. Now, Benjamin didn't take it. Joseph put it there. But that cup is put there. And so what Joseph does at that point is he threatens to keep Benjamin as a prisoner. And then one of the brothers, the one by the name of Judah, speaks up. And Judah says, look, I can't go back. I can't go back to talk to my dad about this. We already lost one brother, and now here's this other brother, and these were the only two that had the mother that our dad loved the most out of all the people that he had children with. I can't go back and tell him that this brother is I'm not going. I'll tell you what, I will put myself in his place. And so Judah stands up and he says, look, I'm going to give up my freedom so that Benjamin can have his freedom. Now, do you know what's incredibly important about that? Is that years later, another person from the tribe of Judah, a descendant of Judah's, a man by the name of Jesus, says, I will sacrifice my freedom for the freedom of all the people. Now, when Judah gets to that point, that breaks Joseph down. And so we pick up in Genesis 45. It says, and Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. That's kind of like an understatement. And then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had come close to him, when they'd done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. And then you drop down a couple of verses. Verse number 7 says, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it's not you who sent me here, but God. Now don't miss this. Don't miss what's going on here, because Joseph begins by identifying himself by what they had done to him. I'm the brother Joseph, he says. I'm the one that you sold into Egypt. I'm Joseph. You remember that, Joseph, right? You remember me. You remember the coat that I had, and you didn't like the coat? And that's the one. I mean, I don't know, maybe you sold some other brothers, but I'm the one. I'm Joseph. I'm the one that you sold into slavery. He begins by identifying what's been done. But he doesn't stop there. He reframes the entire story with 3 words: God sent me. 3 words. You see, that's Joseph's story. It's all true. He's the one that they sold into slavery. He's also the one that God sent to head him. The story is all true, but he gets to choose which title that he's going to use on that story. Is it going to be the title, "You sold me," or is it going to be the title, "God sent me"? See, he's going to be defined. He's going to be defined not by what they did to him, but what God is doing through him. It's all the same story, but he gets to choose how he's going to respond to the story, and he chooses wisely. He's not going to be defined by what happened to him. He's going to be defined by the purpose that God has given to him. He is going to see life through the lens of God's faithfulness and God's redeeming work. And that's true with us. We cannot change the story, but we can choose the title. It doesn't have to be a story of defeat. It can be a story of God's comeback. It doesn't have to be a story about weakness. It can be a story about God's strength. It doesn't have to be a story about rejection. It can be a story of redemption. It doesn't have to be a story of an affair. It can be a story of reconciliation. It doesn't have to be a story of an addiction, and I'm not trying to minimize these things. It doesn't have to be the story of addiction. It can be the story of recovery. You see, instead of looking at life as a victim, he sees his life as God sent. Now that carries through all of Joseph's life. A few chapters down in this particular story, and several years later, Joseph's father, Jacob, Israel, he dies. And what's interesting is when he dies, the brothers are clearly still afraid of Joseph. Because they are thinking, well, maybe Joseph was being kind to us for our dad's sake. And now that dad's gone, we think that Joseph's going to turn on us. And they're scared. But at the end of Joseph's life, in the 50th chapter, the last chapter of the book of Genesis, Joseph puts it all into perspective when he says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of lives." You see, God's intentions rule. They'll rule, no matter what. And Joseph's confidence is in God's plan for his story. And so Joseph realizes that dream was not so much about him, but it was about what God wanted to accomplish through him. He gets that. I mean, this story is much bigger. It's much bigger than himself. And God is telling it. Now, overcoming yourself is difficult, particularly in an age of selfies. Overcoming yourself is a very difficult thing. What social media has done is it emphasizes that the story is about us. It's about how we look. It's about how many friends we have gotten. It focuses on the individual. You know what's interesting is that the research is just now coming down the pike. It's just now we're finding out how all this is playing out. And the research is consistently saying the same thing. The more people use social media, the less healthy they are and the less satisfied they are. A 2-year study found that social media was tightly linked to poor physical, emotional, and social health. Just a couple phrases out of that study said this: the more hours spent on social media, the more the sense of well-being and happiness declined. Went down a little bit farther in that study, and it also said that constant use of social media was directly linked to increased feelings of isolation, anxiety, and inadequacy. I mean, wasn't it supposed to be the opposite? Wasn't it supposed to say that we're now all connected and we're interconnected? That's not what research is telling us. Now I'm not trying to stomp on your Facebook page. I'm really not. Because I know that it serves some great purposes. I understand that. But it has the potential to make us think that life is all about us. That we are the center of the universe, and that makes it difficult to overcome yourself. So what happens in this story is that Joseph has to release all of this stuff. When he was a prisoner and when he was a slave, he had to let go of what other people thought about him. And when his time came to shine, do you know, the only resume that he had was, God sent me. Now I know this, is that when you begin to overcome yourself, you will become a much more forgiving person. Because we harbor bitterness and resentfulness. We harbor all those things because we think that life is too much about us. And if you're struggling with that, it's probably time to stop playing God and let God be God and you start trusting Him. God's got it. See, for Joseph, it was ultimately not about what happened to him, but how he responded to it. Joseph decided that what happened to him would not define him. That wouldn't be the defining moment. What God was doing through him, that's what would define him. And we have the opportunity to choose the title of our stories as well. Is it about what you did to me? Or is it about God sent me? The defining moment is about how we choose to respond. You are not responsible for what happened to you. But you are responsible for the response, no matter what. And that's the story of Joseph. Not a whole lot of explanations. I said that as we began this. Not a whole lot of explanations. Just an incredible example. And it's about Joseph's response in God's redemption. Joseph realized that God sent him. It's always been that way. It's always been about God sending, hasn't it? John said that God loved us so much that He sent His only Son, that whoever believes in Him will not perish, but have eternal life. And we overcome through Jesus. It's our choice. And Father, I pray that you would help us to choose wisely. Help us to know that you have things under control. And help us to choose to follow you. Father, as you're working on people's hearts, help them to respond to you today. Help them to realize that things can be different. That the title can be changed because it's not about what was done. It's about how am I going to respond to that. And I'm not going to be able to do it, but you are through me. Help that to be our choice this morning. In the name of Jesus.